Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming back this morning. Others, I suppose, are on their way. We have a single panel on Islam and exiting violence this morning. We had originally planned to have two, one looking at more political issues, one more theological, but in the end, it seems a little arbitrary to divide them in this way. So we have a single panel. Our panelists, I'll introduce each of them just before they speak, rather than all in a bunch. This is, when one talks about religion and violence, most newspapers, most television screens think immediately of Islam. And so the question is an important one for us. But we don't want to approach it, as is often done, simply in civilizational terms, as though we have what I call a kind of kindergarten view of the world, where there are large blocks of a single color that keep banging up against one another until one or other of them breaks. The speakers we have today approach the question in a much more sophisticated way and in a much more complexified approach. First, we will have Jocelyne Césari, who holds the chair of religion and politics and is director of research at the Edward Cadbury Center for the Public Understanding of Religion at the University of Birmingham. At Georgetown, here at the Berkley Center, she's a senior fellow at our Center for Religion, Peace and World Affairs, and she's also an associate professor of the practice of religion, peace and conflict resolution in the Department of Government, also at Georgetown. Jocelyne.
Good morning. And as a premise to my remarks, I want to give you the major assertion on which the work I'm doing is built, just to start lifting some kind of misunderstanding of confusion. It's going to be difficult to understand what I have to say if I don't give you this background. I am part of these scholars, and I'm not the only one, hopefully, who look at nation as a crucial framework to understand not only politics or institutional action, but also the changes in psyche, in mentality that have affected everybody, including religious thinkers. And so you may know that when you look at nationalism, you have two broad schools looking at it. You have an intellectual tradition looking at the different ideas and conception of nationalism, and you have the work of sociologists who have built an historical, sociological analysis of the cohesion and crystallization of national communities. Interestingly, these two bodies of work never talk to each other. And one of my challenge, and that's why what I say sometimes can fall into the crack, is to bring this together. And to do so, I do not consider nationalism as an ideology. So when you look at religion and nationalism, most of the time you have this broad scholarship that says that religious nationalism or the role of religion in nationalism is an alternative or counterpart to secular nationalism. My point is not at this level. Actually, I consider, and again, this is not only me, there is a broad thread of work done by people like Roger Friedlander, Leah Greenfeld, and others who say that nationalism is not simply an ideology, it's also a set of discursive practices by which the territorial identity of a state and the cultural identity of the people whose collective representation it claims are constituted in a single fact. In other words, nationalism is also, some of these scholars have shown that it changed everything, even mental illness, even emotional repertoire. And I think we have not paid enough attention to the fact that nationalism in its building has also changed theological thinking. And it is part of this challenge that I'm trying to take on. Some work has been done on European nationalism and the readjustment of religion. Usually people look at religious thinking independently of this political, institutional, and broader, I would say, political community framework. But some have tried to do both. I'm thinking of Charles Taylor in The Secular Age. The work of Charles Taylor has been to show that the major thinking in secularization has been brought in by the end of war of religion and the redistribution of state power along the axis that he called immanent and transcendent. When we look outside the West, unfortunately, this kind of work has not been done yet. There is an attempt in a collective book that has been very seminal to me, which is Secularism Beyond the West by Akil Bilgrami, but there is no systematic work to do so. So, having said that, I have done in this work what is political Islam, an attempt to look at the way that local traditions and culture have been readjusted to this new framework. And again, I'm not here in the path of cultural or post-cultural or colonial studies that see this exportation as only an act of oppression. Of course, it was an act of oppression, but I'm also looking at the way that local actors have actually adjusted, adopted, and if you allow me some garden metaphor or comparison, they have grafted and pruned these concepts to make them meaningful in their different local challenges. And when people talk about vernacular modernities or vernacular languages, usually there is this tendency, and it's very clear in the constructivist discourse, that these vernacular modernities were a way of resistance against this imposition from the West. What I'm showing in my work is actually there was resistance, but it doesn't mean that this indigenous local repertoire or alternative were untouched. Actually, the last work I saw was, we tend to look at the Salafia movement of the 18th century as an authentic response of resistance, which it was, but it was also a westernization, what I call even a little bluntly, an orientalization of Islamic thinking under the pen of Rashid Rida, Afghani, and so on. And the way that the term taqlid, tradition, if you look today, everybody will tell you it's a tradition, it's a past, it's fixed, we cannot use it as such, we need a work of reinterpretation. This was not what the tradition was in pre-modern time, and you can see the thinking of someone like Rashid Rida and Afghani pulling up or elevating this new kind of meaning that, interestingly, will also be shared by the secular actors. This is also, in this sense, nationalism is this kind of episteme that is shared by both or multiple protagonists with different interests, but also a common sense that allows them indeed to compete on the same platform. Same thing with the Ummah. The Ummah, you look today at the majority of writing, including by scholars of Islam or Shia or Shuyur, they will say Ummah is a community of Muslim believers. Interestingly, if I look at the way that Ummah was discussed under the empire, Ummah was the totality of territories under the authority of the Caliph, but the Ummah was multicultural, multilinguistic, multireligious. It was never thought as a homogeneous Muslim population. And you cannot find under any theologian this kind of approach. In other words, if I were Greek Orthodox in Istanbul, pre-modern time, I'm part of the Ummah. So what interests me is the change of Ummah as an homogeneous community that is brought by the pan-Islamist movement, the reformist movement, to challenge what? The modern concept of nationality. And that's why you see these changes in theological approach that are intertwined with also the changes in political concept brought by this encounter by the West. So in this perspective, if we want to look at the way that Islamic tradition deals with violence in the context of the state, we cannot avoid indeed to look at these changes of theological thinking, but also of practices of disposition, not Bourdieu, but Norbert Elias, who is the founder of the term. Bourdieu stole the term, never acknowledged that the term habitus was coming from Norbert Elias. And Norbert Elias is central here in this figurational or configurational kind of sociology that tried to bring together institution, relationship of power, ideas, and psyche. Because the way that changes are happening is not only at the cognitive level. It is also how the people are ready to absorb and internalize new ways or new cosmology or new approach to their communities. So this is a moment where you can see this adjustment of conceptual, theological, but also a narrative of what is a political community happening. And in this sense, the work of Foucault around governmentality is also key to understand that. So, because governmentality is not state action. Sometimes when I talk to my colleagues in political science, they say, yeah, you focus too much on state action. No, state action is not the point. The state policy is just a thin layer of a broader proverbial, hidden iceberg. And that's why the connection, the term governmentality allowed me to connect the technique of the self, you govern yourself, and the technique of domination, governing others. And governmentality in this perspective refer to different procedures to regulate human behavior. And you can see the parallel between religious way of thinking and political way of regulating. And in fact, you cannot understand the state action and why they work versus they don't work if you do not first pay attention to the way that citizens have ingrained or absorbed this technique. And under this condition, religion becomes a significant mode of power. And again, it doesn't mean that the state controls the religion. The religion becomes an episteme, a body of knowledge that echo or resonate with the change of power in political communities. And so tradition, organization, discourse, including the discourse of violence from religious actors, become part of this governmentality even when they are opposing the state. So having said this, what does it mean concretely? How does this work? So if we take the moment where the imperial encounter between Europeans and the Muslim world happened in a way that push the kind of dominant narrative of the West, you can find two turning points. One is 1798, Bonaparte going to Egypt. That's the moment where the intellectual thinking among Muslim intellectuals and leaders start to indeed look at this concept from the West. And then another interesting date, that it's 1856. The War of Crimea, the Treaty of Paris, what happened there? I don't have a painting. I should have brought this also. So this is the first time that the international community as a Westphalian system accepts the Ottoman Empire as part of the system. This is also changing the way that the Muslim empire were visioning the international relations. Before that, you have Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Islam. And this is thought from the dominant point of view of a Muslim that run pretty much a big part of the world. the Dar el-Harb, Dar al-Islam doesn't operate within the international system. So the inclusion of the Ottoman Empire within the Westphalian secular-based state system will also change the relationship of the and the conception of what is legitimate violence. And again, not only for state actors, but also for religious ones. So if we take one step forward or backward, rather, sorry, under the Caliphate, Islamic institutions operate in a very independent way from the political power. And here I'm not talking about state. I am not one of those people who call states any kind of political power. Let's be clear, there is political power all the time. That's not the point. But the state is a very specific technique of political power that you cannot compare with the empires, for example. So locally, the ulema are the one regulating what's called the revelation-based communities. They do not pay allegiance to the central power, if there is one somewhere between Baghdad and later Istanbul. Their goal is to make the relationship between different people and groups locally stable. And it means that it also includes the people who are not Muslims. So civil relations, economic relations, arbitration of different kinds, this is what the ulema do. And you can have meaningful reports of the ulema having to deal with conflict between the Muslims and other groups locally, but they address everybody. And this is something that will be lost in the changes towards a national concept that by itself bring homogenization. And as I said before the nation state, there is religious diversity. Again, not everybody is equal. We are not, again, here in a secular age. And if we look at the diversity at the time of the Ottoman Empire, we have to look at it in a chronological way, not to project on the past our secular mind. And so nobody is equal, but at the time, nobody is equal anywhere. Meaning, but the diversity is acknowledged. So the Sharia, again, is not a book. It is not a text of references. It is a methodology. The Sharia is a methodology by which this ulema will produce within the tradition. And in this sense, the tradition is in what the sociologist McIntyre called the living tradition. It means something that I have inherited from the past, but I maintain to transmit it to the future. It's not something frozen in the past. It is a method that I use to make sense of what in the Islamic tradition is called makan wa zaman, the time, the location and the time here, but I am in genealogy or a transmission from the past. And what I do is never going back to the Quran by itself or never going back to the Hadith. So this is what's happening, and the ulema have the monopoly of this interpretation, and they apply it locally. With the decline of the Ottoman Empire, the rise of alternative way of looking at your community, your sovereignty, the relationship to the other, as I mentioned, you see emerging the conflicting project of pan-Arabism and pan-Islamism. And again, to think that pan-Islamism will come later after the failure of pan-Arabism doesn't reflect the reality on the ground. Actually, in the resistance to the colonial power, religious group was the strongest through the pan-Islamist way, locally. And that's why the pan-Arabist or westernized elite adopting the Western nation concept were seen tiny elites. That's why they could not let go of Islam after independence. Because how do you make meaningful sense of a new political community that you have to create from scratch? There was no nation in Turkey. There was no nation in Pakistan. This was created literally overnight. So you had to regain a sense of solidarity, community cohesiveness between people, and remove Islam. I mean, Islam was removed from this local meaning to become an element of the national community. And this happened in a way that has not been challenged until now, and that concerns most of Muslim countries, with 3 exceptions. A connection between belonging to the nation and being a Muslim that didn't exist in pre-modern time. There was no conflation between these 2 belongings. The 3 exceptions are Indonesia, Senegal, and Lebanon. Senegal is a very interesting case in the sense that there was no attempt to create this connection between the Islamic belonging and the national belonging. Indonesia modulated or emulated the India system of attempting, with failing, a sort of equidistance between the state and all religious community. And Lebanon, under the French influence, became what you can call an hybrid democratic regime with a sectarian. It may be the only sectarian, institutionalized sectarian democracy you can find. Otherwise, all other Muslim countries have gone through this connection between Islamic belonging and national belonging. And it's part of what I call hegemonic Islam. And again, hegemonic Islam is not that the fact that the state manipulates the ulema or that control Islamic institutions. This is, again, the thin layer of the iceberg. The hegemonic Islam is the habitus of people, even shared by secular actors, that to be a Muslim and to be part of the national community is 2 sides of the same coin. And you see it also in the religious thinking and the theological debate, and the way that the tradition, as I described it before, has pretty much dwindled, in the sense that the state also has put on the tradition a framework that doesn't allow for thinking independently of the state. And the methodology, even in Islamic universities, doesn't tap anymore into the goal of revelation-based community and managing them with their diversity. So for me, these are key elements of politicization of Islam. They are key elements of the intolerance of Islam vis-à-vis other religious group. I'm a few minutes. So this is, I wanted to show you because some of these considerations actually show, when you look, you may remember, I'm sorry, it's not a very clear slide, but it tends to show the level of social hostility vis-à-vis religion, and usually this is also associated with a greater level of political violence based on religion. And you see that all the countries that are in there are the countries that have established or are living under this hegemonic Islam. Do not think that it's specific to Islam. If you look at Sri Lanka, the situation of Buddhism in Sri Lanka is a parallel one. So instead of saying, oh, I'm going to look into the resources of the tradition to find a way to get out of violence, my take here is to say maybe we should look at the parameters of habitus, mentality shared not only by the religious actors, but also the secular one, in a way to change the way that you think of your religious belonging and your political belonging. The one that are farther advanced in that are the Iranian intellectual thinkers, because they have seen firsthand the damages caused by the collusion between the hierarchy, the clerical establishment, and the state. But I would say that the Sunni thinking is far beyond that. You can see everywhere the attempts are still around the state. I am doubting that this will make sense in the maslaha, in managing the political community, not in the institutional way. And here, this is my last talk. I am Aristotelian, not Platonic in this sense. For me, man is zoon politikon. It's a political animal, not in the sense that it's corrupted and partisan, but you cannot live beyond your community in the sense of police. And if Islam is not able to re-engage with this maslaha at the local community based on a revelation that is not automatically an intolerant one, maybe we can work on toward exiting violence. But I'm sorry to end up on such a gloomy thinking. I'm not sure we are here yet.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Perhaps we can distribute this for people who are interested, because people were not able to see it. Thank you. Our second speaker is Dr. Andrew Marsh, who is a visiting scholar at present for the Middle East Initiative at the Berkley Center for Science and International Affairs, I think, at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He has a special interest in Islamic political thought, especially the Islamic legal tradition, and he's the author of an important work called Islam and Liberal Citizenship, which came out, I think, 2009.
Great. Is the microphone on? I think it is. So the question of the panel, as I understand it, is the following: are Islamic states in the modern period decipherable from the tenets of the Islamic tradition, or are they rather about secular actors that are somehow trying to supply missing religious references? Is the idea of an Islamic state exclusively modern, or is it indebted to long-standing Islamic religious commitments? How has the modern concept of the nation state formed Islamic thinking about peace and violence? So I want to begin by acknowledging three fairly common premises or theses about these questions. The first is that the Muslim nation state came about due to both colonial and regional violence. So this is fairly uncontroversial. The Islamic State was not a conceptual invention of the nation state was not a conceptual invention of the Muslim world, but rather of early modern and modern Europe. The idea of the territorial state, the sovereign territorial state, was something that emerged throughout the 19th, but really more the 20th century in the Muslim world. So this is obviously true. Now, you may differ on how much you think that this is an alien idea, how alienating this has been, or how much this has been a purely colonial imposition, as opposed to something that emerged out of particularly 19th century developments in the Muslim world involved with state modernization, bureaucratization, rationalization, and trying to come to terms with the rising power of Western states. The second premise is a little bit more controversial, that the nation state is not only a historical and physical imposition on Muslim territories, but involves lots of physical and symbolic, as well as epistemic violence against the Islamic tradition, Islamic law, Islamic scholarship, and so on. So this, I think, is getting to something more important at the questions that this panel is trying to address. The idea is not only that after World War I, the French and the British created maps that led to nation states that, for the most part, still exist. And not only that this involves certain kinds of violence, but also certain kinds of constructions of national identities that didn't exist, the partition of Mandate Palestine, the creation of sectarian differences where they weren't as salient before, those sorts of things. But the very idea of the modern state is something that is anti-Islamic. Now, that's a claim that you see sometimes, so most strenuously advanced by the historian of Islamic law, Wael Halak at Columbia, who argues that the state itself cannot be Islamic, that the idea of an Islamic state is a contradiction in terms, because the state has certain kinds of properties. It is sovereign, it is territorial, it legislates, it gives law in its own name, it demands loyalty up to the point of sacrifice and killing, whereas the quintessential, the essential nature of Islam is that it is based on a kind of law that is organic, that is not issued by the sovereign will of the state or any other sovereign authority. It actively resists any kind of state legislation. Any kind of law that's issued or emanating from the state is, by definition, non-Islamic. That law only is what emerges through this kind of ecology of the textual tradition, interpretation, the epistemic tradition of the scholars, and their organic relationship with the Muslim people. Now, a lot of this is exaggerated. A lot of this involves suppressing certain other traditions within Islamic history, but nonetheless, there's a genuine problem about what does it mean for a state to exist and the state, as we understand it in the modern period, to be sort of the central focus of not only loyalty and power, but also the generation of Islamic legal meaning. The third premise is that Islamist movements themselves are characterized by the potential for violence, violent rejection of the modern state. So this might be something that we would be more familiar with just by living in the United States or the West and consuming media. We associate Islamist movements as dissident movements against the modern secular state, as having an ambivalent relationship to that entity, and to be agents of violence themselves, and that for some reason this violence is described in Islamic terms, rationalized in Islamic terms, and is somehow a feature of this clash between secularism, Islamic weakness, and what values Islam really endorses. So that's one view. But there's another view which says that insofar as state Islamization or the demands of Islamist movements in the domestic context have a kind of violent or coercive nature, insofar as that's true, that is because of some of the distinctive features of the modern state. So this is something that's argued sometimes by people like Talal Assad and people that work in his school, which is to say, when we see Islamist movements trying to do things like punish blasphemy, or enforce morality in public, or advance other kinds of non-liberal norms, either through social violence or through state violence, whether or not they have some kind of Islamic rationalization, we should understand this demand to realize Islamic norms in this kind of coercive way, not as emanating from something genuine or necessary from the Islamic tradition, but as a way of taking on the tools and the imaginary and the symbolism of the modern state. So it's a way of saying, if Muslim actors are violent, the guilty culprit here is the modern state, because the modern state is all about violence. It's all about focusing on one legal norm. It's about controlling the public sphere. It's about public order. And so Islamist actors may give those Islamic sort of Islamic rationales, but fundamentally it's the logic of the modern state. So those are two different ways of saying that that the attempt to reconcile the modern nation state with Islamic values is something that is immediately pregnant with the possibility of violence. So those are three premises that I don't disagree with all of them. I don't agree with all of them, but I want to focus attention someplace else. And I want to advance 5 different kinds of theses or premises about what is distinctive about the modern ideal and idea of the Islamic State. And I want to emphasize the ways, not that it rejects violence, not that it's nonviolent, not that it's pacifist, but in which the center of gravity of the thinking, what's distinctive about the ideal, is grounded in an expectation and a hope that violence is not what characterizes politics. So the first premise is that, like with the Western social contract theory, legality and consensus are the foundations of political life. So you see this, I would say, from the 19th century, from the moment in which you get Islamic constitutionalism in the Ottoman Empire and in Tunisia and so forth, and you get sort of Muslim thinkers writing about law, writing about constitutionalism. I think it's particularly distinctive, however, in a lot of the thinking after World War I, particularly in the form of Rashid Ridda and thinking about the caliphate. 1926, there's a great caliphate conference in Cairo. The caliphate's been destroyed by a combination of Turkish republicanism and the loss of World War I. They want to recreate the caliphate. Now, this doesn't match very neatly onto the nation state, but what is it they imagine? They don't imagine a Napoleon-type figure coming out of some existing source of power and uniting Muslim lands through force and then being rationalized after the fact. Arguably, that is the traditional way that Islamic political thought imagines the foundations of political power. You first establish coercive rule, and then it becomes rationalized. Rather, in the modern tradition, you don't have a paradox of, let's say, liberty. You have a paradox of legality. You have a chicken and egg problem that characterizes lots of democratic theory about founding. So for these thinkers, the caliphate could only rest on profoundly consensual and legal foundations. So Ridda, for example, goes so far as to say the Ottoman Empire had never been a legitimate state because it had been founded on coercion and acquisition and had never been founded on the traditional model of the elites of the Muslim community voluntarily choosing a ruler. So you have the classical tropes from Islamic legal theory about the ruler being authorized by the bay'ah, or the act of loyalty, being elected by the elites who are known as the people who loose and bind, or something like the Catholic College of Cardinals. Throughout the 20th century, you have the Islamic State offered as a critique of authoritarianism and tyranny. Of course, in virtually every Muslim majority state, you have had some sort of dictatorship, military dictatorship, some other kind of non-democratic form of rule that by and large doesn't reflect Islamic norms. What is the Islamist alternative? It is a state that is founded on consensuality, legality, election. But again, the crucial aspect from the beginning is that the people are the authors of legitimacy because they are the ones that have to consent to rule. There is, of course, an apologetic motive here to say that we're not against democracy the way that we are often portrayed, and the true enemies of democracy are present dictators. But nonetheless, this is a theme that is ubiquitous throughout modern Islamic thought. The second is that you have a rediscovery of the question of constituent power. So from Arendt and other modern political theorists, you have this idea that the true moment of popular sovereignty, the true moment of freedom, is the moment in which a people has dissolved a prior order and it comes together outside of existing constituted institutions and collectively, without an existing template, without coercion, collectively authorizes a new form of government and a new form of life. Now, this is another ubiquitous concept in a lot of modern Islamic thought, and it's profoundly problematic because Islamic political thought, particularly in the modern period, begins with a few assumptions that government is already necessary. There's no sort of anarchist foundation of the social contract. There's no need to argue for the state. Coercive authority is always assumed to be mandated by God and thus necessary. At the same time, the shape that this takes has been reconsidered, I think, for the first time in the history of Islamic political thought. Up until arguably the 1920s, it was assumed that the form of government that Islamic law mandated was the caliphate. And this, of course, emerges in the past few years with ISIS and the debates between ISIS and al-Qaeda around how do you refound the caliphate. But it's a ubiquitous feature of Islamist thought from Maududi onwards that the form that the Islamic State takes is not itself predetermined by Islamic law. The caliphate is not the form that it must take, and thus new institutions, new forms of relating institutions is subject to the law of maslaha, as Joscelyn said, is subject to the law of what is in our interest from in this particular time and place. And the crucial thing here is that this is not a question that is monopolized by elites at the level of theory. The idea is that the people, in the broadest sense, are called upon to participate in the authorization and in the design and recreation of new institutions. So you have the idea of the people already as something like a sleeping sovereign. The idea that the people can awaken, authorize a new form of rule, authorize rulers, authorize scholars, authorize a constitution, and then it's not clear what form that they continue to take. The third premise is that the question of law, codification, positive law, the role of the state, is a profoundly complicated question in modern Islamic thought and modern Islamic practice, and is much, much more complicated and subtle than you would have if you just read Wa al-Halak and you said that any kind of codified positive law is essentially at odds with Islam. That's ahistorical, it's Orientalist, it doesn't take into account a century at least of practice amongst Muslims to think seriously about what aspects of classical Islamic law ought to be preserved, how it ought to be changed, how you compare the textual tradition to modern exigencies and so forth. And this comes with it new kinds of institutions, parliaments, new forms of juridical bodies, new forms of courts. And again, a very, very important thing here is that Islamic law is not only being justified in terms of tradition, not only being justified in terms of authority, but in distinctly modern terms as a form of emancipation. So even in some of the more anti-democratic Islamist thinkers, people like Maududi or Qutb, you have this implicit argument that the people must be appealed to, that the demand of modernity is for people to be both free and governed. And this is accomplished by the Sharia because of its properties. But nonetheless, you have this sense that it must be it's primarily non-coercive. It primarily is about the way that it interacts with human moral psychology, and it's inherently emancipatory. So to conclude, the fourth premise is that I think that the core concept of modern Islamic thought is not the idea of divine sovereignty, is not the idea of violence, is not even necessarily the idea of the Islamic Sharia. The core, the most central idea is this idea of the universal caliphate. And this is the title of the book that I'm about to publish this forthcoming year, The Caliphate of Man, which is that from Maududi onwards, you have this idea that politics is organized around the assumption that the people at large has been deputized by God. The entire community enjoys the status of God's vicegerent or caliph. And what this, in the first order, does is it deprives any sort of pre-political legitimacy from any other kind of agent. No ruler can be sovereign because the people is God's deputy. Not even the scholars can be sovereign because the people collectively is God's deputy. And so this vision of a thoroughly consensual, thoroughly legal, and nonviolent political order is based on this idea that a free people can consent to govern itself and be governed in this way, both because of what the people actually wants, what the people desires, how the people is disposed, but also because this is what Islam actually calls for. And so, in my opinion, the contemporary crisis of Islamic political thought is not violence versus nonviolence. And it's not, the intellectual crisis is not, although it is in fact the material crisis, is not suppression and torture and tens of thousands of people being in jail in Egypt, although of course that is true. It's that there are I think, certain kinds of obstacles to this vision of an ideal regime type that is consensual and is based on a kind of popular sovereignty. One problem is the iron cage of the modern state and existing elites that will do everything possible to prevent this kind of radical constituent authority and Islamists from trying to shape a regime. But the other more interesting obstacle is that the people is not how the Islamists see it. Muslim populations are no less plural, no less divided, no less diverse, morally speaking, than Western populations are. So this quintessentially modern problem of moral pluralism, reasonable moral pluralism, and radical disagreement on how people should live, what the source of authority is, that I think is the genuine obstacle to this vision, not of an Islamic state, but to a thoroughly Republican, consensual, legalistic, nonviolent vision of politics that I think is what actually characterizes most of modern Islamic political thought.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Our third speaker is Professor Ibrahim Musa, who hails originally from South Africa. Ibrahim is Professor of Islamic Studies at the University of Notre Dame, with appointments in the Department of History and the Kroc Institute for International Studies in the Keough School of Global Affairs. He co-directs with Scott Appleby and Natalia Omer the Contending Modernities project, part of which is a very interesting project called in engagement with the madrasas in India and Pakistan. A very interesting project, which I'm sure Ibrahim would love to share with us. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Jose, and everyone for inviting me here. Delighted to be joined by this great panel. So I'm going to give you two stories, and let's see what kind of sense it makes. So the one vignette is, during the 2013, when the military overthrew the elected government in Egypt of Mohamed Morsi. At that time, a very interesting debate emerged on television screens and on the internet. One was the figure of Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who is a traditionally educated scholar from Al-Azhar, but who's been exiled from Egypt during the bad years of Sadat and Mubarak, and he made a home in Qatar, where he also had this important platform on Al Jazeera of Sharia and Life, a very important Sunday project, Sunday program, that at some point in this delicate balance between Qatar and the regional countries, they had to pull Qaradawi off the airwaves. But Qaradawi was kind of the kind of Sunni, kind of Khomeini figure for the Egyptian uprisings and the revolutionary fervor that was there during 2011. He comes flies into Cairo and leads people in prayer in Tahrir Square and so on. So he's quite an important figure in that respect. And Qaradawi, basically, you should think of him as a traditionalist, but he describes himself as a traditionalist slash Salafist. Traditionalist slash follows the Salaf. So a traditionalist means in the sense that he follows the madhab, he follows the canonical tradition of interpretation that everybody explained here, especially in law and theology. There's a canonical tradition, and he's obedient to that tradition, but he also admits that there are times that this tradition does not help me. Then he goes back to the teachings of the early founders, which is the equivalent of the church fathers, or in the case of Islam, it's more the first 2.5, 3 generations of Islam. Those are the go-to places. So all traditional Muslim scholars, in one way or the other, would always return to the Salaf. That's where the inspiration of the teachings are. And if you're in doubt how the canonical tradition developed, and that could be a messy business because the canonical tradition could be entangled with political and other kind of cultural developments that today will seem to be appalling and unacceptable, you can always jump back to the early period where you can make your way out with that. So that is Qaradawi. He sees himself as a traditionalist slash Salafist. The other person in the debate was Sheikh Ali Juma. Ali Juma used to be the official Mufti of Egypt. He has a background in business education, and then went into study not Islamic law, but I think he studied theology, and he's very much connected. So there's a difference between if you study Islamic law and Islamic theology. When you study Islamic law, you were kind of a kingpin. If you study theology, a little bit less significant, or if you study hadith, even less significant. So that means you couldn't get into the school of law at Al-Azhar, so you go for the other options and so on. So Ali Juma has that reputation. There was also a lot of questions that when he became Mufti of Egypt, why is he Mufti and so on, but he also had some interesting opinions, and he qualified for that position in the view, because that's a state-appointed position. So the debate then happened is that when Mursi was overthrown by Sisi, and I keep on getting this Mursi and the Sisi confused. So Sisi is today the kind of the president. When Sisi overthrew Mursi, the question arose that what has just happened? So Qaradawi from Qatar says that Sisi is a rebel. In terms of Islamic law, he's a baghi, he's a rebel, he opposed the legitimate order, and he should be done away with, or you should deal with him as a rebel. Ali Juma, who's been more sympathetic to the establishment politics as it now appears, he said, he quoted an authority, said, Al-Imam al-Ma'zul la shar'iyyata lahu. That a deposed imam, now you have to follow this word imam, a deposed imam has no legitimacy. Okay, now look at the language of these two figures, right? One is talking about a rebel, the other one is talking about a deposed imam, and the deposed imam, that is Mursi, has no legitimacy, hence he's gone. It's over. You have to deal with a de facto situation that you have Sisi. Now, the last time I checked, that in that system of Egypt, when Mursi and others came into power, they started writing a constitution, and there's a big debate which constitution now is effective and so on. But parliament laws and regulation was done according to a constitution, and these were the rights and responsibilities and duties. What do these two guys talk about? They're talking about medieval Islamic political theology. And nowhere in the constitution are you going to find that endorsed or part of the narrative. But it is part of the narrative. It is part of the narrative that for many millions in Egypt and around the world, that narrative has some kind of legitimacy. And that narrative legitimacy is been contested by the legitimacies of what Andrew and Jocelyn talked about, the nation state, the legitimacy of the nation state, and how do you domesticate the nation state concept within an Islamic language. That has been the debate. So basically, my first point would be that you're having the Islamic tradition falls between the historical and the contemporary. And this effort to bridge those two is still a work in progress. It's a work in progress. It's way too early for people like Hallaq to declare the death of this and the death of the state and the possibility. I mean, Muslims are living within nation states, and many of them are feeling very good about it, and many are feeling very bad about it. They don't think that something that the nation state is a horror, and other things that the nation state is a practical thing that they should live with. So that's the first thing. Second point also comes from Egypt. Around about 2013, 24, I think it came to the news around about 2014, that some people were sent to jail for crimes that they committed. It seems that in around about 2013, during this the pushback on the part of the Egyptian people against this attempt by the military, a group of Mursi supporters chased a group of either secular or Sisi supporters up a building in Alexandria, and then pushed those pro-regime supporters or the emerging regime supporters, threw them off the water tank to their deaths. And the court then judged. There were two videos of this. One video showed very graphically these bodies falling down. The other video showed a woman observing this from a distant balcony, from a distant building, and screaming, haram, prohibited, unlawful. You cannot do this. This is not lawful, this is not moral, this is not ethical, right? And what the story tells you is that in the same way that, these groups who've been chasing each other are utilizing and instrumentalizing their norms and values towards killing their opponents, there are others within Muslim society also saying this is unacceptable. And that would possibly be the majority. That would be the majority that would say haram. And that would also be the majority around the world that would say, whatever you've done to Jamal Khashoggi, that's also haram. Whatever had happened to him, whether he's abducted or dead, or somewhere in a place where he will never emerge from. So this question that this woman talks about, haram, is about this whole question of moral vigilance, to distinguish between good and evil, between right and wrong, which is the central teaching of Islam. Occasionally, this moral vigilance also deteriorates into vigilantism, where people take the law into their own hands and then do things. So it's possible that those who did the killing of their opponents went to the extreme of moral vigilantism. And therefore there's a big debate whether it's it's the state and state apparatuses that would enforce the moral and ethical code, or are individuals also empowered to do that? What are the limits of that? These are issues that occur in one way in the medieval textbooks, but they have yet not been interpreted and explained. How does it work in a modern society? So for instance, my friend Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid, who was a scholar of literature at Cairo University, he wrote several books about the interpretation of texts and the writing of how does one begin to think about the meaning of text. And then he was more kind of left-centered and so on, and talked about the materiality of text. So when he went up for promotion to full professor at Cairo University, a number of people objected to his promotion, saying that some of his views that he is articulating go against the a priori beliefs of Islam, the doctrines, and therefore he's on the verge of apostasy, if not an apostate, and therefore he should not. Now this was a very interesting way in which this doctrine of hizbah, the doctrine of a certain kind of public vigilance, managed its way into the public sphere. Egyptians thought that that doctrine was already put to bed and it had no activism, but clever lawyering brought that doctrine back into activism, into the courts, and the courts had to give it a certain amount of acknowledgement. And then it went through different courts. Finally, the highest court in Egypt declared, and that was the basis of the petition, that this man's ideas and views are no longer conforming to Islamic teachings. Therefore, he's no longer a Muslim. We cannot execute him as an apostate, but we can definitely say that he's not a Muslim. Therefore, his marriage with his wife is over. And that was the end of that story. So an ancient doctrine that came through the Ottoman period, and what Egyptians thought that Hizbah doctrine was over, it was revitalized, and I'm not sure whether the Egyptians have since subsequently abolished, passed law to either limit it or to eliminate that. Thank you. So what I'm saying here is that there are instances that even at the highest level into the judicial system, this kind of vigilantism can make its way into it and have very bad consequences. Now it seems that what this question of moral vigilance also generates is that it requires us to see the dialectic between Adam and Satan. It seems that Satan too changes in many ways over time. I quote from the novelist Muhammad Ash'ari in his novel The Arch and the Butterfly. He writes, "We discover another side of Satan as if with time, and it is as a result of all the tragedies he caused or that were committed behind his back, he has changed, adopting a kindly wisdom completely unrelated to the menace that caused him to fall from paradise." End of quote. One of the greatest challenges this novel prompts us to think about, and from my discussions about my early comment on the question of moral vigilance, one of the greatest challenges to Muslims today is the question of the ethical. It's not simply the need to find new methods to arrive at complex ethical and moral judgment. That's just one. Rather, the greatest challenge is the very idea of change is often viewed as anathema to those who adhere to the pre-modern tradition of ethics, to some extent, not always. And therefore, the ulama are not a homogeneous group, but they are also very diverse among themselves. Given the authority of the canonical tradition in shaping the going currency of fiqh, which is people call Islamic law, commonly translated as Sharia or Islamic law, it is indeed a challenge to propose changes. This is indeed especially true given the power invested in Muslim clerics as guardians of the tradition. However, the Muslim canonical tradition also provides resources in favor of change. For example, the famous intellectual Ibn Khaldun, who was also a trained scholar and also one who served many political dynasties in North Africa, from the Merinids to the Dawadiris and others, who died in 1406, which is the kind of the beginning of the early modern period in Europe. He observed that change is inherent to all societies. He says, the condition of the world and of nations, their customs and sects, does not persist in the same form or in a constant manner, he declared. There are differences and changes from one condition to another. And then he quotes a verse of the Quran that says, this is the custom of God already in effect among his servants or among mortals. Here Ibn Khaldun is fortified his observations on human history with scripture. Aware of the need for change, Ibn Khaldun nevertheless lamented that rarely do more than a few individuals become aware of it, that is, become aware of change. Ibn Khaldun's argument can be contrasted with some piety-minded Muslim scholars who view change negatively. These scholars argue that change would impede upon the ascetic and simplistic ideals of the origins of Islam. Piety-minded scholars often associated change with the end times, where good and bad become inverted. The renowned polymath Abu Hamid al-Ghazali died 1111. During his mystical phase, began to say things similar to that. He frequently employed these tropes to show how degraded society in his time had become by moving away from the Islamic ideal. He cited comments made by the Prophet's companions to support his claims. One of these is he quotes a companion by the name of Hudhayfa bin al-Yaman, who acknowledged change in customs, practices, and social tastes. However, as with Ghazali, Huzaifa, who was a companion, viewed this as a negative development. As Ghazali wrote, he says, Hudhayfa said, more incredulously you could find your good practice, your ma'ruf, of today might become the wrong as time goes by. And your wrong today could become the good of a time yet to come. You will continue to prosper as long as you know the truth, and your learned persons do not conceal it. And Ghazali then says, he, Hudhayfa, surely spoke the truth. Indeed, most of the good practices in these times were wrong. These were the wrong practices in the time of the companions. In other words, it says that Ghazali says that what we consider to be good practices were in the time, in the pre-gone era, considered as wrong practices. That is possibly Ghazali's kind of ascetic moment coming in there, and his objection was that people are building much more bigger mosques made out of marble and those kind of stuff and so on. But I think on the face of it, Ibn Khaldun or any other sociologist would agree that change could result in an alteration of conventions and practices that were once deemed unfavorable to become approved. Both Huzaifa and Ghazali thought ethical change from the approved to becoming disapproved and vice versa were signs of the end times. However, a different hermeneutic can be applied to Hudhayfa's statement. In Hudhayfa's view, there was a qualifying clause regulating change. The litmus test for the requisite or even legitimate change in his time rested on the vigilance of the learned people, or certain kind of vigilance of the learned in every era. As long as the learned were attentive to the truth, the haqq, and the big picture of what was right, then clearly ethical change would not be catastrophic, and therefore the role of the learned. There's a famous story of the Prophet Muhammad, that he was preaching in the mosque and a Bedouin comes in and says, "Oh Muhammad, tell me when is the hour?" And he was giving a sermon, so he ignored him, and the guy asked for 3 times, and when the Prophet was done with his sermon, he said, "Where's the guy who asked about the hour?" And he says, "Here I am." And said, "Okay, let me give you the answer." So he said, "You want to know when the hour of judgment is?" He said, "Yes." He said, "Well, it is when responsibility is destroyed. Expect the hour." So this is a clever Bedouin. He asked, "How is responsibility destroyed?" And Muhammad gave the answer, and he says, إذا وسد الأمر إلى غير أهله فانتظروا الساعة. When matters are placed in the hands of the incompetent, expect the hour. I think most Americans, at least half of America, understands that. Half, or maybe plus 2 million of the voting public. I'm not talking politics here, of course. So I think this whole question of responsibility. See, one of the things is that in modern Islam, there's been a gravitation towards the Quran as the only authority and ignoring the Hadith tradition and the complex tradition that develops from the Hadith, that the ethical components of the tradition has been lost. And with the arrival of modernity and colonialism, all Muslim ethical practices were then framed under this moniker of Islamic law. Yes, there was law historically in Muslim societies, but that was done, this law that was adjudicated through the court systems, and the court adopted it. But as Andrew pointed out, there was also a discursive tradition outside the state where people talked about things that might appear as a legalistic form because they use Aristotle, they use analogies, syllogisms, and very complicated ways of deriving rules and interpretations and so on. But these were more of a, in my view, ethical nature, and I'm sure there are many people that disagree with me when I say that. So finally, I want to say that on a whole host of issues, given our topic today, from blasphemy to debates about ISIS, legitimating slavery, people talking about this in one way or the other, these are all issues that got to do with the deep epistemological crisis in contemporary Islam. There's an epistemological crisis, and epistemological crisis like this, and that is that many of the advocates of this reform are people who know the tradition well, but who are not fully aware of what is the modern tradition. And with the result, there's a very simplistic engagement with the modern tradition, a very kind of instrumentalized way of dealing with the modern tradition. So people could read a few texts and so on and say, oh, Muhammad Abdul knew that, and Rashid Rida knew that, and Maududi knew something else. But it doesn't mean that you are schooled in the modern tradition, that you know the subtleties of it. And the big lack is the absence of the philosophical of the modern. The lack of what is the modern philosophical tradition, that you really need to understand how a historical tradition can work in the modern period. These are one of the challenges. I will tell you more from the table, that some of the work that I'm doing right now from Notre Dame called Madrasa Discourses, where we're training 50 recently graduated madrasa students in India and Pakistan, and exposing them to new debates in philosophy, in history, and those kind of issues, gives me some hope of the possibilities that one could find people who are well-versed in two traditions, who could make a difference through their thinking, but it's a long road. There's no quick solutions to this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ibrahim. I want to give a little time to the panel to question one another, because the various things that they have presented kind of overlap. We have 45 minutes in any case, so there will be time to open it to the floor also. But I'm going to pose one question. Yesterday, there's an element that was mentioned in a number of panels, and that's the notion of solidarity. And of course, underlying what all of you have presented is a certain idea of solidarity, and it's a classic part of Islamic thinking, particularly wala. But it goes, of course, with bara, the dissociation. There's a solidarity, but also a dissociation, a disowning of the other. So just in order to try and mix perhaps the discourse that we've had this morning with some of the other discourses that we've had during the conference, I wonder whether that concept of solidarity might be a point where we would engage those. But I place that before you. I don't expect you to answer that directly, because I want to give you a chance to also engage with one another. But if you wouldn't mind keeping that on in mind, that would be helpful. Jocelyn?
Actually, I would like to remark on your. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
You made a very interesting distinction between moral vigilance and public vigilance. And it's quite interesting that in your example, the one that embodied this moral vigilance is a woman on the side. And that's what, it seems to me that the political discourse on Islam has squished moral and public vigilance. And has given, but this is true anywhere, in any kind of configuration of power, when the public vigilance takes over the moral vigilance. And so if we look at other experiences where traditions get out of political violence, it has something to do by disconnecting what the theologian calls the revelation-based community from aims of political power. You can say, yes, this is like kind of abstract and maybe not easy to do, but looking at the way that nationalization goes hand in hand with a remodeling everywhere. Again, I'm not thinking that Islam is particular in this regard. But what bothers me is that the thinking of Islam in its majority today has to do with the political power. So what I'm observing in other traditions is an attempt to, successfully or not, is not the issue here, but to think of this moral vigilance outside of the public vigilance. And maybe the two of you can respond to that, but for me, all this discussion of the caliphate it is a very national discourse, in the sense that it thinks of the universal good in a manner that is bounded by political communities. The caliphate is not just, and who is included in this caliphate? You see, if I look at what the ulema was thinking, or the Muslim thinker was thinking before the nation state, they were not thinking of a caliphate. They were thinking in very pragmatic terms on, I have this, as you were saying it, about the jurisprudence, I have this community to manage. What is my goal here? It is not about constitution. This is a very modern, you are right, this is modern, and the debate modern or traditional doesn't make sense. But it seems to me that you cannot think of solidarity in a way that will move away or diverge from this public vigilance. The moment you have public vigilance, and here it's a political scientist in me again, I mean, you cannot be morally always equal in terms of what your tradition is telling you to do. This is also what the just war tradition was about in some way. So it is kind of, nice to think that we can get away with only, why Muslims, I'm going to be very blunt, sorry everybody, why everybody thinking about the state? Why?
You asked us to.
No, it's not you.
Okay.
No, it's not either of you. It's if I look at the thinking of Muslim intellectual today, a lot of it, and you're right, has to do with power, sovereignty. When if I look at other religious tradition, I see other dimension of it.
I mean, can I take a stab at this? Andrew will give the best answer. Is this thing on?
Yes.
Okay. So I think part of the reason why people love the state, because they were told that the state is going to be your savior by the Western masters. And they've been educated for the last 100 years into this thing. And if they even amend the state in any kind of way, what has been the last 50 years the biggest opposition to anything is that Muslims cannot experiment in any other kind of state formation of an Islamic state, and all Western powers were opposed to it fundamentally. They cannot do that. So, and I think the other sense is right now is that people in a Muslim world the extent that I monitor these places and people Muslims living in the West, they're feeling extremely beleaguered. They're feeling beleaguered. I mean, they can see the beginnings of the 15th century happening again in Europe, the way people are talking about Muslims now. Oops, it's telling me to shut up. No. Let me just switch this off. Cancel. Thank you. You know, that people are feeling really afraid, and they thinking that, you know, that the state will protect them, right? So state power. I mean, what happens in Egypt? You know, why did all those millions of people that went into the streets to support a new order, those very same people came out 18 months later, in one way or the other, supporting the other side? I asked very devout friends of mine in Egypt, why? They said, you know, what happened in the interim was that the police and everybody just didn't do their task, and people became afraid of insecurity, the lack of security. And then they realized, let's rather have the dictatorship than insecurity. And they couldn't get anything done, right? And so they were letting, and there's been a lot of studies about that. It's this question of insecurity that people want security. Why do you think the people in Raqqa or Mosul welcomed ISIS? Because they felt that they were being left out by the Iraqi state. There's no accounting of that. The only people who are going to be sent to jails and who've been executed once they get hold of all these people who did that are going to be the people who rebelled according to classical Islamic law, because they rebelled against state authority, and that's also what's going to happen is happening in Iraq. But the sociological conditions on the ground that made it possible for ISIS to establish its order there was also something that at least some percentage of Mosul's population wanted that. Whether they felt it was their time as Sunnis because they're going to be overrun by Shias and it's sectarian, or they felt there was no state. So I think this question of the political has become the number one issue. My own opinion is that there's too much of an emphasis on that. It's overemphasized. Everybody's thinking in very, very isolated terms and thinking in very narrow ways that the state is going to be the solution. My argument is, and my place now, having gone through a whole range of positions on this, is that I think it's only the remaking of a robust intellectual tradition, a remaking of it, not a carbon copy of what happened in the past, but the remaking of a very robust intellectual tradition that Muslims have been talking about from the past, of taking the old and the new and making something different, would be one way to save the Muslim soul. I don't know about their bodies, but definitely their soul. Okay.
I think two things came up in Jocelyne's comments. One about what is a national discourse, for example, the relation to the caliphate, and what does the classical tradition say? And then all this business about why is everyone thinking about the state? With not a very few, but with some exceptions, I don't like saying that something is completely alien to the classical tradition, because you can find X and not X in almost any tradition. And so particularly this issue of what you said about, well, the scholars just wanted to get down to governing or applying the law or the rulers or whatever it was, but that's exactly the point, right? That's exactly the point, is that the question of territoriality, the question of practical authority, that this discourse of governance was not just something that existed in the madrasas or like for Shia scholars kind of, as an ideal discourse that was not necessarily what's being implemented in the courts. It was precisely because Sunni political thought was so practical that you get these realistic kind of Hobbesian or Machiavellian discourses about, well, the ruler is the one who has authority, and if he's ma'zul, then la shari'ata lahu, right? So, and then if you want to look at the details, of course, you have all of the, you have this long tradition in Islamic constitutional law about how there can only be one imam or one caliph. Well, what's the assumption of that? The assumption of that is that the idea that there was a physical geographical space that was united by under coercive authority and juridical authority, even so long after that was the historical norm, that remained the juridical norm. So I don't, I don't like to sort of say, well, everything that modern Islamists or Muslims are doing is completely alien from the Islamic Church. I think you have to go question by question, and you also have to have a certain historical sensitivity to there are certain things that were not chosen, and what is a more or less intellectually reasonable response to this? And that gets us to the question of the state. So, of course, they're going to think about the state. Of course, the state is there. It's extremely powerful. It's real. And so why not think about its legitimacy? It's maybe I'm misunderstanding what you were saying about thinking about an Islamic state. But for me, it's perfectly normal that, after the formation of states, through colonialism, World War I, partition, whatever historical process you want to privilege, of course it makes sense that once you start to have broader political movements, that these would be ideologically disposed. So sometimes they're ethnically disposed, sometimes they're based on class, sometimes they're based on elite bargaining. But the idea that you would have a big idea emerging from Muslim countries, and that big idea being grounded in a moral vision, isn't at all sort of bizarre or odd to me. Having said that, I do think that that does require a certain kind of path dependency. So insofar as Islamism is defined as a kind of sovereigntist discourse, a state-centric discourse, even if that doesn't exhaust everything that's going on, that does make it harder to think about other kinds of ways of thinking about publics, counter-publics, morality, lived realities. And I think that is, I hope, the future of a lot of Islamic political thought. And so last January, I did this week-long series of dialogues with the Tunisian thinker Rashid al-Ghanouchi, and hopefully these will be translated and published as a book. And I think a lot of where his thought is going involves saying this vision that you have a unitary public sphere that is united around a moral conception is not realistic. That's one premise, okay? So he takes seriously the fact of moral pluralism, even though he continues to have a skeptical attitude about the epistemic foundations of it, right? So in trying to get him to think about Rawls and Habermas or Kant's kind of antinomies, he'll say, no, Kant is wrong about the antinomy of the origins of the universe. Any rational being can arrive at belief in God. So he still has this kind of dogmatic kernel that there's a limit to rational pluralism, but he takes it as a fact that you're not going to have a united public sphere. Second is the Islamists have a terrible, terrible, terrible history with the state. The first post-revolutionary prime minister of Tunisia was, I don't know how many years in solitary confinement. So they are profoundly aware of the grotesque and monstrous power of the state. And I think some of the more thoughtful and ethically disposed ones, this not only leads to a desire to capture that awesome power, but to also take seriously how dangerous the state is. So a lot of what people like Ghanouchi are saying, well, we have this vision of a richer civil society, pockets of freedom where people that want to live pious lives are given those institutions, but that this is not assumed to be something that is coercively established throughout the state. And I think that, maybe it's my own biases, but I think that ought to be the future of Islamic political thought. And it'll be interesting to see whether that is developed in a more intellectually rich basis. To conclude, I hope also what you're doing at Notre Dame, so my understanding of a lot of modern Catholic political thought, there are anti-modernist traditions, anti-democratic, anti-enlightenment that held sway for a long period of time. But from a certain point, the kind of acceptance of the modern state, acceptance of the Reformation, right? Last week, I think, was when the Reformation was finally accepted as here to stay, meant that Catholic political thought has many, many different rich traditions in modernity, post-Enlightenment Catholic political thought, in which you don't just assume this unified moral order. So I think there's a lot of resources for a theological tradition to develop a political response to modernity that does think outside this idea of capturing the state.
Yes,
Was that
we could go on, but thank you. I'll open it up to the floor now. Jose, Sir Khan.
since, Andrew, since you ended with this comparison with Catholic sociopolitical thought. The fundamental difference, of course, is that Catholic thought was based on the Constantinian ideal. And as long as you have the Constantinian ideal, you have the idea of a confessional state. And it was only when this idea, so this is not the origin of Christian thought, you go beyond Constantine to the Patriarchs and so on, and you open up the possibility then again that you don't have a Christian state, you don't need a Christian state. But it seems to me that precisely what you have presented is the opposite. You have an idea of a proto-popular sovereignty that was never realized because these other political institutions were never fully Muslim. So you have a real public sphere through the ulema, and then you have the caliphs and these political institutions that were there, but then they were truly Islamic. But now you have the possibility for the first time with modernity to really realize this ideal, popular, divine sovereignty. And it gets fused with the modern state. And this is unique. You don't have this either in the Protestant tradition, which of course broke completely with the idea of a Christian state, or precisely with the post-Constantinian Catholic thought that also broke with the idea of a Catholic state. So it is this idea that was there always dormant but never realizable.
I don't know if it was dormant, but
well, at least this is what I got from your interpretation of this, at least. That is really what is, I would say, the nut of the problem.
It's your discussion when you talked, I'm happy to learn more about that, where you talked about the caliphate of man, right, or something like that.
That's a modern idea.
So that was going to be my comment too, that's a very modern idea of talking about the caliphate of man,
Yes.
which I don't think then you'll disagree with Jose, is that this possibility that you can talk about this caliphate of man as a kind of a philosophical ideal, a theological ideal, a political theological, and then that means the making of the self in a very different kind of way, which is consistent with Islamic teachings of the caliphate as a stewards of God, right? The stewardship and the vicegerency of God. Every human being has got that responsibility. But I thought that the way I heard you speak is that you were saying that it's that ideal that you're pushing. Sounded to me a little bit like the Bosnian president, what's his name, Izetbegovic. He also talked in that kind of philosophical terms. So.
Can I add something? Because you said it's unique, you're absolutely right. But I just wrote an article. I was asked to compare Turkey and Israel. And you can see the evolution of the Jewish tradition in a parallel way. The Jewish tradition, because there was no dominant power, was based, the religious authorities managed locally, okay? And the political project was an ideal. But indeed, I would make the comparison because if you look at the report of what people were doing, and there are tons of reports of courts and lively discussion, they don't think of this power as, of course, it grants security. This is the key point. As long as we have security, we can manage our things. And the whole Jewish tradition thought of it politically, but in this local sense. And the moment they encounter the West, what happens, the Ashkala, which is, they say, oh, no, we are not political anymore. We just think of ourselves as a community of believers under the mundane power. And then came the Zionism. And that's why the Zionism is exactly the equivalent of this political Islam. It's saying you have the right as a religious community to have a nation, but in the modern sense, not in the sense of...
Israel and Pakistan are the same thing. It begins as a secular state project.
This is what
Islamist
we have
project.
The hardest time as Westerners to capture, because and what is interesting is that in the case of Judaism, this tradition outside the state has continued to exist, although it has been also retwisted. But what I'm saying is there is no equivalent of this independent of thinking outside, indeed this caliphate of men, about what does the tradition bring to people on a daily basis, which is also a political question. The political question is not on
of the self.
Exactly. And that's a key element that for me is a weakness in the current thinking. Ranucci, I like him very much, but he criticizes the state, but his parameter, that's what I call this psyche, that is not criticized enough. And I see the diversity in other religious traditions where it is discussed. Today it's about what is the right Islamic state, but maybe there is a way to be political outside the state. That's what, I'm sorry. I can talk about.
I have two questions, one for Dr. Ibrahim. You didn't mention about the problem of ijtihad in the 20th century and nowadays, because who is the legitimate ulama in the Muslim world right now? Because even in the Eid al-Adha and Eid al-Fitr, people cannot decide in Azerbaijan, we will follow the ulama in Saudi Arabia or Turkey or Iran.
He's talking about the religious holidays.
Yes, and even it's a
No one can agree which is the which is
and
pluralism. For God's sake, why do you want to?
Which is good.
and second question is, what's the ultimate goal of the Islamists because in Sudan and in Turkey, the Islamists already came in power and they are ruling the nations, and they failed in Tunis and in Egypt. What are their ultimate goals?
When you go first, let me think about this question.
I don't know what their ultimate goals are. I think it's worth asking whether in Turkey they're still Islamists. I wonder whether how much of it is an ideological project and how much of it is a sort of, kleptocratic, nationalist, sort of individualistic project. So I don't know the extent to which it makes sense to try to understand Erdogan and the AKP through an ideological lens. I tend to see it more through the lens of, the rising sort of, populist right-wing trends in Russia, Israel, Turkey, Hungary, Poland, United States, Brazil. So I think that's where. Maybe then just this final attempt to. So when Jocelyn and Jose were asking, I wasn't sure if they thought that there was something at odds with what I was saying, that whether it was just part of a conversation or whether it's something that I'm supposed to respond to. I guess what I would, so I do have some sympathy for, let's say, people like Talal Assad that will say, well, it's the states that's the problem. I think they go too far. So in the example that you raised of Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid, some of them will say this whole idea about punishing somebody for what they say through hisbah, that's only because the state. Sharia never did stuff like that. It's complete nonsense, right? So I think sometimes this Assadian stuff pushes people into nonsensical claims, partially because they don't have any knowledge of classical Islamic thought. But I think you can keep this idea that the state is a problem and that the state has its rationales, it has its way of doing things, and you can approach it from a liberal perspective to say that, this can involve the destruction of civil liberties and religious liberty as well. But I think another tradition that's going on here is the tradition of critiquing sovereignty within political theory. So Hannah Arendt and this idea that the desire for sovereignty is a desire for mastery, it's a desire for control, it's a desire to close off the plurality and the potentials of life and freedom, and that politics, you always need to keep a sphere of politics that's open to something other than the anti-democratic rationale of sovereignty. So while I think I understand why it happened, I do think that the sovereigntist imaginary is something that had a limiting effect on a lot of Islamic political thought. And I think in some of those few spaces of political, legal, and social freedom, and Tunisia is one of them, I don't know if India is also one of them, I think that it is worth provoking this idea about what exactly are the ideological and doctrinal contours of post-Islamist thought, right? Beyond pragmatism, beyond just accepting external realities, what is the deeper sort of principled understanding of how the focus of cultivating the self, moral cultivation, an ethical critique of capitalism, an ethical critique of the state, how that can occur without sovereign monopoly over the state. I think that's more than just a pragmatic acceptance of reality. I think there's a very, very fruitful sort of ethical and philosophical project there. And perhaps it requires some distance from the Arab Spring and the violence of Egypt and so forth for people to feel that they can think that through. I do happen to think that Ghannouchi is doing that more than what his work up until the Arab Spring suggested.
David?
Can I follow up on that?
Ibrahim never responded to the ijtihad.
Oh,
question
I'm
about
sorry.
jihad.
I will respond in once.
Should I go ahead then?
Yes, please.
Let me follow up. I think that's very provocative and very interesting, coming at this from a Christian and Roman Catholic point of view. I mean, there's been, going back to the establishment of the Westphalian nation state, 1648, whatever. I mean, the Pope condemned it against the state and saying this is inadequate. Now, there were self-interested reasons for that, because the Holy Roman Empire was being dismembered in the process and the Pope was losing power and so forth. But within the Roman Catholic tradition, that suspicion of the Westphalian nation state has perdured. And it has perdured in terms of a sense that there's a common unity of the human family. It's also perdured in the sense that there are transnational agents of various sorts, including the church reaching across borders, but also the endorsement of human rights activist groups, and so the sort of thing that your colleague Catherine Sickink talks about with terms of the transnational advocacy groups that are working across borders and so forth. The Catholic community is certainly endorsing that kind of direction, plus international agencies, whether it be regional, the Organization of American States and the African Union, or going to the United Nations and so forth. So we've got a variety of layers of organization of politics, from the local all the way to the international agencies, with lots of crisscrossing non-governmental agencies moving across borders. And I think from the human rights point of view and from the Roman Catholic endorsement of that, that's a good thing, rather than thinking simply of sovereign nation states controlling everything. Are there attitudes within the Islamic community today? I mean, the debates we've been hearing have been about the significance of sovereign nation states, and whether it's plus or minus from an Islamic point of view. But are there Muslim attitudes toward these other kinds of governance structures, whether they be explicitly political or whether they be more informal, like non-governmental organizations that operate across borders? I'd be interested to know whether that's an alive sort of question in the Islamic world, because it's very much alive in the world that I live in within the Christian tradition.
Can I address that? There are, but they are minority or marginalized, and I have to say most of it come from Islamic institutes and or people who are educated and working in the West. Like
movement that originated in South Asia because you don't have an Islamic state like Tabligh.
yeah, but then the Islamic State of Pakistan happened, and you are right. In India, you may have this way of thinking, although they are very much enmeshed in a conflict with Hindu that is also changing the parameters. Again, the way of thinking is very influenced by the relationship of power in which you are. So what I'm saying is you see a remarkable attempt to do that by an intellectual or scholars. My problem is that if I look at the socialization of new generation of Muslims, especially in Muslim majority countries, again, the transmission is not only an idea or an ideational transmission. It's also disciplining the body, the mind, And if you look at the way it's done in most of educational system, it is very much about confining the definition of good Muslim to the definition of the nation state. And that's the problem I have with. Yeah, exactly. Senegal, because you have a vibrant existence of local communities that do not automatically have in mind this sovereignty or central sovereignty. And that's what makes a difference.
Let me just briefly inject a few points. The contemporary epistemic crisis that I talked about is also kind of the crisis of understanding history and the way history operates. So you're going to find, for instance, that modernist interpretations of Islam basically focus on scripture, a certain piece of the Sunnah that's translated Hadith, and that becomes the foundations of solving all questions of truth. Whereas in the traditionalist, and Jose, you mentioned the tariqah, that is the Sufi orders, or the Jama'at Tabligh, which is a transnational Islamic pietist movement about reviving basic practice of Islam and so on, which unfortunately has now gone through a big political turmoil right now because of the division of leadership in India. Nevertheless, they would, for instance, argue that Islam is about a man that God spoke to, and he created a community, right? But for the Muslim modernists and versions of Salafism, it will be God gave us a text, God gave us a book, and if we run with that book fast enough, we will get to the kind of the destination. So the messiness of history is what Islamists miss out. So, for instance, in this whole debate, what is the ideal political order? One of the things we didn't mention is the Islamic Republic of Iran. Iran establishes a theocratic democratic kind of political system that it thinks it works out of a revolutionary chaos. You had a new kind of system that emerges there. Now, of course, it seems that Iran has been put for some of its conduct, but I think there's been a way in which we have dealt with Iran, especially the West, that has made it impossible for any Muslim actor in a practical way to deliver the goods of statecraft and order and those kind of stuff. Turkey tried, and Turkey did at some point, and now Erdogan is going through a different set of gyrations that doesn't make sense. Or you had kind of, a place like Malaysia that has growing prosperity, stability, Indonesia for that matter, and Senegal, as some of you mentioned. So coming back to this whole question of the epistemic question, that is just one. Just on the question of governance and the question of the caliphate, if you read authors such as in the 14th, 15th century Ibn Khaldun would talk about the caliphate, the early caliphate, yes, but then when you have the emergence of a monarchical caliphate under the Umayyads and the Abbasids, he's not making judgments and say these people are all terrible people and they are bad people and they're not Muslim and so on and so forth, like the way the Islamists did and so on. So the Islamist reading of Islamic history is that everything went wrong after the Rashidun Caliphate. Everything went to hell. And therefore Muslims are... So it's a scapegoat historiography that they have. But then at the same time, they want to claim we produce Averroes, we produce Al-Biruni, we produce all these scientists and so on. Under what thing? Did that thing happen on the moon? No, it happened under those hated empires, so to speak. So the big question is political-theological. The big challenge in this epistemological conflict is the political-theological that has to be rethought, because what we've inherited is a political-theological of empire. And that empire is no longer... There might be an empire of souls and bodies, but the political empire that aspire to, therefore, all these things from Ghannouchi, who's a very close friend of mine, to others, keep on thinking within those modalities, and it's very difficult to break out of that, break out. On this question of ijtihad, when South Africa had its first elections in 1994, Ghannouchi was a guest of mine for about a month in South Africa. And we talked about all kinds of things. He was in exile. And this question of ijtihad came up. Ijtihad, for those of you who don't know, is the question of intellectual exertion to be able to, discover new ways and interpretation of the tradition, but also find, rules and moral outcomes of a certain kind, but mostly juridical. So that was used, the term. So he says to me that, at the time of Muslim decline, you cannot do ijtihad. I said, why? He said, well, you're going to be, the hegemony of the other is going to be part of your thinking. So I said, it makes sense. But when you're down, you really need new ideas. You need creativity when you are down. So you can push it out to some extent about the hegemony of the others. But what that showed to me was this whole question that knowledge of the present, and especially knowledge of the modern world, produced that its originators were the West. It's deeply, Muslims are deeply ambivalent towards that. And that ambivalence means that those who are at the center of theological and moral thinking keep on falling back on the old without a proper understanding of what is the condition of the present to make that fix, which will mean a lot of change that you will have to endure. So that's not happening. What is happening is that young Muslims, especially those in the West, and you talked about the alternative communities, your question, that Sufism is the #1 industry all over the Muslim world, and especially in the Muslim West. Everybody wants to be traditional, but what is tradition? Okay, grow a beard, wear the hijab, that is tradition, okay? Very superficial understanding of tradition, and if you can quote an ancient authority, you're even better, right? So once you can show that, but how that thing works in the present, and that's become a kind of $1 million industry, that people can be sold those things. So it's also not very genuine, but it's a certain way of dealing with the soul and the immediate, existential crises that people have of love and friendship, and how do you deal with the other. So I think that this question of ijtihad, in my view, unfortunately, has become a kind of an empty vessel, because unless what Muslims think about as ijtihad is going back to the yellow pages. Yellow pages go to the old texts and do ijtihad. That is not ijtihad. Ijtihad, when you have to deal with a new epistemological framework, and from that you have to do some serious interpretive work. In the same way that ancient Muslim authorities, they didn't have yellow pages or tradition to lean on in order to make their decision. They dealt with the reality as it was. They were heirs of the Indian, the Greek, and other traditions and so on, and they work from that knowledge base. The problem with contemporary Islam is that the knowledge base has been quarantined from the purely Islamic and what is seen as the secular, the bad, and so on. And finally, I think Talal Asad is my friend, but it's not so much Talal, but Talal, some of his supporters that go out of control. So. And he's ambiguous, and he doesn't.
Yeah, his thought is a lot more subtle.
Much more subtle. That's it.
You take the doctrinal part and you just apply that.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So yeah.
It's not wrong. That it's clear how it gets there. The other thing is, just like in the Catholic tradition, you have to keep in mind the very, very vast Islamic charity networks. So. And educational and things like that. But with an eye on the time, I actually maybe bring it back. There is a school of thought that also will place international jihadism in this context, which is so it has some silly forms and it has some less silly forms. So I'm not a huge fan of Faisal Devji's idea about the jihadist in search of humanity or something like this. But there's a guy at Chicago, Darrell Lee, in anthropology and law, that has studied the migration of jihadis to Bosnia, which is a conflict that maybe is easier for some of us to see as a legitimate application of international jihadism. And that also comes right square with the question of the modern state. And so the modern state and any individual state does not exhaust, in fact, doesn't even begin to provide the locus of loyalty for someone who wants to think about justice, self-defense, emergency, life and death, what you would sacrifice for, what's worth killing for, all of these sorts of things. And so now a lot of this, from my perspective, is pathological in the sense that it is not a genuine kind of universalism, right? There are hierarchies of blood and hierarchies of people that are worth dying for and sacrificing for. And I don't know if you think that the Catholic just war tradition maybe also traditionally has a problem of seeing Christian blood as different from heathen blood. but on my understanding, at least there's a potential for a more genuine universalism. So, but nonetheless, I think the idea, so one way of looking at this is the pathology of the modern state and the way in which individual nation states don't, again, not only not,
Yeah, exactly. That's
yeah, but again, I think a lot of, right, I think that also works in the sense that, you know, the better angels of a global public sphere in the West are those that are the most critical of nationalism and are the most critical of modern international law that seeks to monopolize killing and dying within the framework of the modern nation state.
yeah. Yeah, I
Right, well,
tried.
that is interesting. And so, wala, I wouldn't call it solidarity, but loyalty and affiliation.
This is yeah. Yes.
Right, I'm saying I wouldn't, yeah, right.
Outside of the bounds of solidarity.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think there is a genuine question about as long as the political community is defined in that kind of confessional terms. And again, I don't think that it's, you know, wrong or evil or pathological to define your political community in confessional terms. It's no worse than a lot of, it's certainly in ethnic or racial terms. It's far superior to that. But nonetheless, as long as you're doing that, you have this question of, that, like Jocelyn was raising, who is the sovereign community that can make law? And who is outside of that, even if you have a Muslim name, and who is inside of that? But then, of course, also the issue of sovereignty as killing and dying. I think that idea that the most appropriate political community for that kind of notion of loyalty, solidarity, up until life and death, the idea that religious identity gives you that answer is one of the great survival stories of modernity in the nation state, for better and for ill.
Okay, can I?
Well, not the confessionals, the ummah, the idea that the locus of authority, for better or for ill, is the ummah, are people that are Muslim from Bosnia to New York to Bangladesh. That idea remains extremely powerful, even after, you know, a century and a half of attempts to right.
But
The imagined empire.
The imagined.
yeah, but
You know, you
this
say empire. There are worse things than empire.
this is not an empire. This is
I'm
an
not saying it's a bad thing.
this is an imagined abstract territory. It's the ummah, as you describe it, is a topos. In other words, if someone pre-modern time will come and hear this discourse about the ummah, this would not make sense, in the sense that, again, the ummah was not invested in the way that you discussed, because it's true, it's Rashid Rida, Afghani. This is an attempt, and it's clearly said in his writing, to respond to the national project, okay?
I disagree with that.
No, no.
I think the classical scholars would absolutely recognize what's going
no,
on.
but-
That blood if it's in Tatarstan under the Tsar, it's part of the ummah.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. But
Yes,
the
and that's
Ummah
the
is
modern-
not made-
yeah.
The Ummah is not made of only Muslims.
Thank you.
Shani.
No, no. That's why you have not read the traditional and classical.
Okay.
There is no reference to the Ummah as this powerful community of Muslim believers. The Caliph is the guarantee of the security of all the territories, and it does include people who are not Muslim. The
Thank you,
enemy-
Jocelyn.
The question of solidarity is about who is the enemy, who is out is the people who are pagans, and it doesn't include Christians and Jews to start with. Or today start to have this discussion, even with clerics, they are not clear on that. And that's what I'm trying to say.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to step in because, well, as we can see, there's a lot still to discuss.
That's clear.
The audience has been becoming restless, partly because that clock is fast. But on iPhone time, it's only 11:01, so we're just 11:02. We've just moved to 2 minutes over. Please join me in thanking our panelists for a lively discussion.